Well, welcome, Christopher Worth, to the briefing room.
Thank you.
Today, you're welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about your book, The Rabbit Hunter. I have two out of the trilogy.
Yep.
We specifically going to be talking about the Battle for Greece today, which
Yes.
is, I
Yes.
believe, is the volume one.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
I found this the exciting. The action was excellent, but what I found most engaging was the relationships between the characters.
Yes.
I thought
Yes.
that
So,
God, sorry.
thank you for that. Yep. So what got me going on this whole thing, because as you know, I'm a chartered accountant by by training and by career, and everyone says that accountants have no imagination. Which I beg to differ. But what got me going on this really was that in New Zealand and Australia, Anzac Day is almost exclusively these days about World War One,
Mhm.
and the fact that World War Two happened obviously is known, but now that all the actual veterans of World War Two have passed on, apart from if it's if it's the fingers of one hand, if they haven't passed on, um, then and I began to feel that we were celebrating Anzac Day, or celebrating if that's the right, we were observing Anzac Day wrongly, and B, there was very little focus on anything um, that had happened since, except that the speeches often were about what a perilous world we live in. But it was all about World War One, and in New Zealand and Australia, Gallipoli. So I thought I would have I would have a go at doing something about that, basically. And I don't think the battle in Greece is at all well known.
Why did you choose to do a fictional book about that battle?
Yeah. Um, well, yes. So to go back to how this started for me, and probably the answer to that question will become obvious. To go back to how this started for me, so we'd been in Moscow for 7 years, and when I left New Zealand to go to Russia, I knew that there wouldn't be a guaranteed job to come back to. So I was a partner in Coopers and Lybrand in New Zealand, became a partner in Coopers and Lybrand in Russia, and after we merged, it became PwC. Ultimately, I came back in the year 2002 and didn't have a job to step back into. So, one thing that I'd always wanted to do was to see if I could write a novel or write a book,
Mm-hmm.
probably a novel. And so, when we came back, I went to a fiction writing course um, put on by a Polytech in Dunedin, and some of you'll laugh at this, but some of what now is in book three started out as writing exercises at that course.
Oh wow.
So, and that is about book three is about the escape from Crete.
Mm-hmm.
So, Greece wasn't really in my thinking, uh, really. What got me started, if I go back a long way, and you'll see why the connection to Crete, was when I did my OE, my overseas experience, and because I was working for an affiliated firm with Coopers and Lybrand in the UK, in New Zealand at that time. We're talking now the beginning of the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I could get a transfer to London. So I went to the UK and worked in London for 3 years. And of course, as you do, I went and bummed around the Greek islands in my holidays a bit. And I ended up on Crete. I found this room for rent sign outside, went inside, and there was this, can only describe her as a little old lady in black. When she asked for my passport, and I showed it to her because it was a New Zealand passport. The effect still has the effect on me. It still has. She looked at me and she said, New Zealand. And it was the look. I've never forgotten it. And when I went away, and of course, I was relatively young. I think I was about 26 or 27 at the time. Hadn't done any research, knew that the Battle of Crete had happened, hadn't done any research about where you might go if you wanted to find out about what the New Zealanders did there. Mm-hmm. Went to the wrong end of the island by going to Heraklion. Anyway, but the reaction of this lady left a lifelong impression on me. And when I thought about it later, as a more mature person, she would have been, I would think in 1980, 81, whatever year it was, she would have been probably only in her 60s, and she would have been either a teenager or a young adult in 1941. She would have seen it all and then lived through what happened next. And I thought that if I ever wrote something, I would like to write it about Crete. So I know this is not your battle for Greece, but so as I say, what happened was the first things that ever got committed to paper were writing exercises that I did in this fiction writing course in about 2003. And then over the years, so the fiction writing course finished. I then actually got invited to join the Chartered Accountants in New Zealand, their practice review team, which was and still is. So it's like Ofsted in a way for schools in the UK. Mm-hmm. It's the institutes making sure that chartered accountants and public practice follow the standards. Is the best way I can describe it. And because we have a lot of relatively small chartered accounting firms, you end up going all over the country. So I did that for quite a few years, and writing then these books sort of became a bit of a hobby in spare time and evenings and so on. So the books themselves had a gestation period, I would say, of something like 20 years. And when someone says, well, how long did you take to write this? Really, I haven't got a clue. The books came, and I had one assessed at a point, and I'm looking back now, I think it would probably be the formative version, which was rewritten a couple of times, of book 2. Had it assessed by a professional, book assessor, someone who helps you create a book out of a mumble jumble of ideas. He asked a very simple question, well, why don't you start at the beginning? It's no good starting at the point where they're leaving Crete. Why don't you start at the beginning where it all started? And of course, that was Greece. Mm-hmm. So this is the long-winded answer. I apologize for that. The long-winded answer to your question. So why Greece? And Greece was even less well-known than Crete. So in New Zealand, the great sources were the battalion histories from the Second World War, which were produced in the 1950s. So I happen to have, because it was the one closest to hand, this is the volume on Crete. So you can see they're quite big. They're all about this size, and you can get a history this size on the 23rd Battalion in the Second World War, the 20th Battalion, all of them, basically, plus other, smaller things that happened. And of course, there's histories of what we did in the Pacific War as well. So I went to the battalion histories, a couple of them, the 20th and the 23rd, and basically looked at what was happening to those battalions in Greece. So realizing that I had to put my protagonist, that was Neil Rankin, the fictional character, into the actual situation as it happened, I ultimately chose the 23rd Battalion. So he came from, well, I'm sitting talking to you in Clyde in Central Otago. He came from this town, basically.
Oh, right.
And so his battalion, I then followed through Greece. And why a fiction? Partly, I think, because of that little old lady in Heraklion. You cannot really get to the emotion of it or the effect of it or the effect it has on people if you don't write something from inside somebody. That was, I think, my thinking. So there are lots of histories. Some obviously are better than others. I thought, in order to stir interest in this whole thing, I thought it was better off trying to write a novel from inside a fictitious character who then takes part in pretty much the actual things that happened.
Yeah. And how do you decide where historical fact ends and fictional storytelling begins?
Right. So in book one, just here somewhere. In book one, the chapters are pretty much like, here's one at random: 17th April, the track to Kokkinopoulos. So that is the up until about where they go to Thebes in this book. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read it. Is pretty much based on actual dates and actual places. So the deployment to Greece to start, that was the first time that the New Zealand division had come together as a whole anywhere in the Second World War, because the first we called them echelons. The first echelon out of New Zealand went to Egypt. The second echelon out of New Zealand, so the first echelon left, I think, in December 1939. The second echelon left in January 1940, and the second echelon went to Britain. And the reason for that was, by the time they were getting near Britain, getting near the Middle East even, Britain was fighting the Battle of Britain virtually. The Germans were on the doorstep. They were already in France. France had fallen. So the Second New Zealand Division, and the reason it's called the second is because the first went to the First World War. The Second New Zealand Division didn't coalesce as a force in full until it went to Greece, and that was in April 1941. So my character, the second echelon effectively sailed from Britain, and the first echelon went from Egypt. Oh, right. But then all the dates are accurate from there onwards. Nikki and I had also been on holiday a number of times to Greece and to Crete. One of the holidays in Greece, we stayed for a week odd in Patra, which is on the Gulf of Corinth, on the Peloponnese side of the Gulf of Corinth. And thanks to a lovely, huge EU-funded bridge across the Gulf, you could easily drive from the south side of the Gulf of Corinth to the north side and start to explore places like Messalongi, which is where Byron is celebrated, his his heart is buried in Messalongi. And Thebes we went to, and the mountains to the west of places like Delphi, where the Oracle of Delphi was held sway somewhere at some ancient time. So we'd stayed a week in Marathon. Marathon, it turned out, when I looked into it later, was where the bulk of the New Zealand division got evacuated from, but not all, because I found that there were such a chaotic time and such a chaotic evacuation that people got evacuated from all over the place. There were some that I know of got evacuated from a place called the Bay of Olives, which is on the west coast. Others were chased all the way down the Peloponnese. And the saddest ones ended up in Kalamata, which is right on the virtually southern tip of the mainland of Greece. And I say the saddest ones because the action that I've called in the final chapter of Book 1, which I've called The Ride of the Valkyrie, is based on a counterattack that desperate men, basically Australians and New Zealanders, mounted at Kalamata, where they actually overran the town, took all the Germans there prisoner, but then, of course, they had no way out. So they had to ultimately give them all up and be taken prisoner themselves. There was no option because there were no boats, and the evacuation had stopped. But the action that they took to overrun the town was short, sharp, and very bloody. So where does fact finish and fiction start? So the way I've described the action on the Aliakmon line, how it ended, the retreat to Kokkinopoulos, all of that's based on fact. There was a spur. I think the 16th platoon even was, certainly the 18th was which in my book, the fictional character Boney Anderson is the platoon commander of 18 platoon. The platoon that held the far end of the line some of its men were in the snow line, and that's all factual. And basically, they shot Germans like they were shooting deer. But the scrub and stuff was quite sparse at the higher level. But further down, where my main action takes place, around the little town that got bombed and so on, that's all based on fact. The way the defensive line had been constructed is all based on fact. The way the Germans attacked it is all based on fact, including the war dog that turns up in about the first contact. That's all based on fact. It's just that what I've done then is take the fact and made up what they say and how they react and the interreaction from as much fact as I could glean from the historical records books that I'd read, and a lot of personal accounts that I read over the years. So I sort of had this idea of what it might have been like, and never having been in combat, it's sort of had to make that up. I had quite a lot to go on that I'd read. So the armoured car at Kokkinopoulos is fiction, but the rest of it's based on fact. The Germans were probing down from the higher passes. Kokkinopoulos, there was a big action there, and when they left there, they went down into the valley and got trucks out from there. So all of that is fact.
Well, you certainly can't tell because it's all so realistic. You can't tell where facts in fiction end and begin.
Right. Well, thank you. That was my aim,
Yeah.
but also to give you the sense of what it was like.
He certainly does that. And moving on to the book itself, what was the vibe in Athens like when the New Zealanders first arrived?
Well, the opening chapter starts with them arriving in Piraeus Harbour. So this is the 23rd Battalion. Some are already in camp. The ones that came from Egypt are already in camp, and they were greeted like conquering heroes. That is all true. The march through the streets. So they were taken by bus, I think, from the Piraeus port to an assembly area closer to central Athens itself. And I've described them as, getting hotter and hotter, full kit, blazing sun. That's all partly imagination, but I can just imagine that because that's exactly what happened. And then they marched into central Greece, where they were, lots of women and older men, because by this time Greece had been at war with Italy since the previous October, and the young men were all away fighting on the Albanian front. In fact, by this time, I think the Greeks had pushed them back over, the Italians back over the Albanian border, and were threatening to overrun the whole of Albania, which is why Hitler had to intervene partly. Anyway, so the march through Athens to the Hymettus camp was exactly as described. There were women throwing flowers. There were people clapping and laughing, and the march did take them past the German embassy. And and I imagine that was deliberate. And when they marched past the German embassy, of course, there were a lot of ribald comments, about up yours, Adolf, and all the rest of it. And they did sing the song that I've put into the book. That's all fact. And I think that gives you a great sense of what the vibe was, both from the civilian population and the men that took part, who were, by this time, especially the ones that had been in Egypt, had not seen anything significant in the way of combat. They'd been away from home already from December 39 to April 41. And, they were well and truly ready to take somebody on. And the ones that had just arrived from Britain had seen the effect of German bombing on civilian populations. They had already experienced attack, albeit at a distance, but no personal combat. So none of them had any idea how they would go, but they knew that they were ready for something. And that they were spoiling for a fight. And walking past or marching past the German embassy told them exactly who they were going to fight.
Yeah, that there's quite a lot that made me laugh in your novel, but that made me laugh when they did that.
Yeah.
And what your man in charge, Neil Rankin, what makes him the perfect lead for this story?
The perfect lead. One of the things that did happen was, and particularly with medical students, was that there was the class of 39 graduated from university, got on the train and went to camp. There were a lot that did that. And as I say, particularly the medical students who graduated from university in 1939, almost to a man, if they were medically fit themselves, went into the Army Medical Service, or one of the military medical service, and they are ultimately the doctors. These are men with no experience. Ultimately, the doctors who do most of the initial patching up in places like Greece and later Crete, and many of them became prisoners as a result of the fact that they didn't leave their patients. Though there were a lot of young men that had graduated in something else, Rankin is a lawyer, or had finished a law degree. Not sure that we ever know what Boney Anderson had finished, but he'd finished something. And they basically got on the train and went into camp, because that, in the case of the two, Anderson and Rankin in the book, they'd both been in the Territorial Army, or before the war. It was sort of the officer training corps, which is run by run through the university. So they had that all. It was a logical thing that's what would happen. But it's very typical. When the New Zealand government set out to form a division, or an expeditionary force to send to the aid of Britain, I think they targeted sending a force of about 6,000 men. As soon as the recruitment, or as soon as the announcement was made, they were flooded. I think by December they had 16,000 volunteers or more which would form a whole division. So hence the echelons. They couldn't all fit into camp at the same time. They didn't all volunteer necessarily at the same time, but they went into camp in stages, and they came out of camp in stages, and they were shipped off overseas. But in terms of the ideal man, he was educated. He was much younger than the men he was in command of, and he was, I think you'll find, he's a nice guy. He's an honourable guy, although he strays from time to time. I thought I've tried to create someone who's human and relatable, but sensible enough to be put into a position that he's in and to get out of it. Yeah. So that's what I thought would make the ideal leader, if you like. And interestingly as well, so when the first book came out, I you know how you send sample copies here, there, and everywhere, and one of them went to the Ministry of Defence, which is responsible for the magazines like the Army News and Navy News in New Zealand. And the comment that came out of it was that I think the action was realistic, and it was a good description of small unit. Yeah, so I was quite chuffed with that response, because presumably that was written by someone who knew what he was talking about.
And like I said at the beginning, one of my favorite things about the book is the interpersonal relationships between the characters. How important was humor? Because I find a lot of humor in your book. And how important was the humor?
Humor is very very important, because I think humor when you're facing a stressful circumstance, and humor when there's a lot of boredom. So I think the book also, you get the same sense that the war was about 90% boredom and 10% terror. And the humor of both circumstances, I think, is quite important for people keeping their sanity, and being able to take themselves slightly out of the reality, and just how they get along. It's sort of team behaviour. You know, you always find in a rugby team, or a sports team of any sort, you'll always find people chivying other people, and people taking the mickey out of other people, and it's just what you do. But I was quite keen to capture the voice of the time, and I think it's a reasonably accurate reflection of how how they behaved. The other thing is probably perhaps to a British reader, the informality of it. Like, men talking either calling their officer by his nickname or by his Christian name might be quite unusual, but that's absolutely fact in the circumstance, in this unit. I mean, in every unit in New Zealand and probably Australia, that they would hardly ever call the man sir.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, Freiberg, the general, is on record as having said something along the lines of, "This would be a Māori camp. He'd be out, doing something, going somewhere, and someone would be just as likely to say g'day to him as they would to salute him." And he's a general.
And how much did the soldiers actually know about the German threat early on?
I think very little. They'd seen that, they knew that obviously, especially these ones, because they'd been in Britain, they knew that the Germans had overrun France in a fortnight and were had been clamouring at the door of Britain. So they knew the adversary was pretty well organised and pretty experienced. I don't think, though, that they just looked at it, I think, as a football team might look at taking on a well-organised adversary, that it would be something that, we can deal with this if we get a chance, or we can give it to them if we get a chance. I don't think they knew very much. They certainly, I don't think, realised that something like 12 divisions of the German army would pour through Yugoslavia. I don't think that really entered into their minds. How I think they knew they were better organised and better armed, probably, but beyond that, they were pretty certain that the men individually were inferior. I'm pretty certain of that too.
Seriously underestimated the Germans then.
Yeah. The German threat, yes, was. Nobody knew either then, of course, that Hitler had a timetable because he was clearing out the southern flank to ensure that his invasion of Russia could go ahead according to timetable. Nobody knew that. So nobody knew quite what the imperative behind the German army was. And especially so from time to time in Greece and certainly in Crete, there's absolute astonishment at what the Germans are prepared to do to win.
What did the force of the arrival, when did it turn to serious war?
Well, the Germans broke through. They broke through from Yugoslavia, basically, and Bulgaria. Bulgaria was already effectively an ally of Germany, but they broke through from Yugoslavia, and the threat was they would outflank or outflank the Ally-Akmon line. So the Ally-Akmon line and the north up by Salonika were overrun in a matter of days. The Ally-Akmon line, that's where the first encounter was, but the Allies couldn't hold the passes, and the threat was always that they would be outflanked, and the Germans would come in behind them, roll them up. I think, as I said before, the Germans attacked with something like 12 divisions. The Allies had 3. The bulk of the Greek army was on the Albanian front and wasn't even in Greece, and had its back to the action through no fault of its own. That's where the Italians were. And so really, the thing was a foregone conclusion from the start. But I think politically, Churchill had needed to offer something in support of Greece to keep faith. I don't think the New Zealand government even approved that the force be sent. But anyway, it was. So the men would have been not aware of any of that, and they wouldn't. I don't think they would have had a clue about the force that was ranged against them, really, either. They just were there to do a job, and they were just itching to get on with
it. There was a few skirmishes before Mount Olympus, and
Yes.
what was it like for these men to face the power of the Wehrmacht?
Well, they sort of watched it coming, really. So these particular ones that populate my book, they watched the action out on the plain. There were skirmishes, probing attacks, and so on. But they until the Germans came on in force, they didn't really. They'd seen the German Luftwaffe in action. They'd also seen the effect of their own artillery firing from behind them onto the plain in front of them. So they can sort of see all this like almost like it's I don't know, some sort of rolling progress, but coming towards them. But it not probably until they got down to dealing with them man to man. They I don't think they had very much idea of what it was going to be like. And where I've described the action, the Germans didn't use tanks because Mount Olympus was too steep. But in other places, they soon found out that the anti-tank rifles were of no value whatsoever. The Allies had no armour at all, or might have been a very small squadron, couple of squadrons or something of British tanks, but basically most of them had no armour whatsoever to support them, and there was virtually no Royal Air Force. So it didn't take long to realise that they were up against a pretty difficult, hard place, with the rock being the sea behind them somewhere.
And not only that, they got the Germans to contend with, they'd got the terrain to contend with. So can you talk a little bit about the terrain on Mount Olympus and the difficulty?
Well, the terrain, yes. So initially when they got there, this is the New Zealanders, they got there, the weather was fine, and it was sort of like being in a Boy Scout camp. They did a lot of digging trenches or strengthening the trenches that were already there, and so on and so forth. When the attack actually happened, the rain came down, so they had to contend with cold, wet, and mud. And the road that should have been finished to evacuate them, so it was known as the back road, out to Kokinopolis, was not finished. So basically they had to walk, and this was over some serious mountains and through some very deep valleys and up the other side in pouring rain, freezing cold, and mud up to your hocks, and very, very slippery. So it was a very forbidding experience, and also at this time the basic army uniform was woolen serge, and a lot of the men found that unless they had full-length long johns on underneath them, which not all of them did, the wool got very baggy when it got wet, but it also chafed, and some of them chafed themselves raw in their inner thighs on the road, and some of them simply abandoned their trousers because the pain was more than they could take. So they would just have no trousers on under their greatcoat. So when they got to Kokinopolis, there was quite a lot of thawing out to do, and a lot of them were pretty seriously tired, very tired, hungry, and in some of them quite poor physical condition.
Mm.
Anyway, that was followed by what happened next, which yeah.
Well,
So it was difficult.
the German paratroopers were formidable.
Yes.
How did Rankin's sharpshooter background help?
Yep. So the first time they encountered them was at the Corinth Canal, and this is also fact. The Corinth Canal was effectively captured by the German airborne Fallschirmjäger, and what they found was they jumped very low, probably less than 300 feet. Certainly less than 300 feet. I think in Corinth, I think they thought it was probably down to about 200 feet. 200 feet isn't very high for a parachute to open and a man to land. But the thing about, as I understand it, the thing about German parachutes is that they had no fall lines. They had no controlling.
Mm.
So the parachute is fixed to a ring, a D ring, a big D ring on the back, behind the man's neck, his shoulders, on his back, and it's opened by a static line, so fixed to a line in the aeroplane. He jumps out. They used a classic cruciform position, so that they missed the tailplane on the way out, and his back was in the right place to pull the static line and pull the chute out without him getting anything tangled in it. And then virtually they only became upright with their feet down just before they hit the ground. But what they found, more so, this became more obvious in Crete, but what they found was the Germans were quite slow to get out of these because they didn't have a quick release harness, and because they didn't have steering lines, they couldn't actually avoid obstacles that they might hit. So this became a real issue, I think, for them in Crete, but not so much on the open ground at Corinth. Now, I wrote the Corinth incident pretty much from my own experience. We'd driven across, and the holiday we'd had there, we'd driven across the bridge at the Corinth Canal, and I wrote that I knew where the exit track out, or the exit little side road out to Corinth town was. I knew the layout of the rail yards and so on. I'd seen it all for myself, and I wrote that from my own experience. Memory can be fallible, so some of it may not correlate with other people's understanding of it, but this is 1940, so it can't have been that much different. But anyway, so the sharpshooting ability was, first of all, that these men hit the ground, and then they sort of had to get at least onto their knees to get out of their harness, and then there was a question about picking up their gear. So there was quite a lot of time, especially if you've got someone shooting at you, quite a lot of time exposed from the time your boot hits the ground to the time that you've actually got a heavy weapon that you can return fire with. And Rankin was quite good at finding them. Of course, there's a hell of a lot of dust and smoke, so it's not always it's not necessarily an easy shot, but yes, that's definitely an issue, and this became, I think, a real issue for them in Crete when they got there, for the Germans. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier, the tiredness and the physical exhaustion.
Yeah.
Did that affect the personal dynamics within the platoon?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it probably yes, I think it probably did. But by the time they got to the next after Thermopylae, so from Ely-Akmon line, they went back to Thermopylae. Thermopylae, they didn't really have any serious contact with the Germans. From there, they retreated through, or mine did anyway, retreated through Thebes and then down along the Corinth Canal to the Corinth Bridge. And it was really at the Corinth Canal Bridge that the next action took place, by which time they'd had, I think, quite a, not restful, but they'd been out of action for several days. And I think most of them had probably got their strength and vitality back. Not sure about their trousers, but so scenes on the evacuation that I drew about ratting roadside supply dumps and things, that's all true. So I think somewhere somebody ends up with a 5-pound tin of plums or prunes, and someone else gets a 10-pound sack of flour or something. And that's exactly true. And then they made up whatever they could make for themselves while they were in transit at night. So that's all true. So I think by the time they got to Corinth, they were probably a little bit restored. But Corinth had also been fairly anxious time getting there because of the road traffic on the roads from both sides of the Corinth Canal Bridge, from the side coming down from Athens and from the side coming along the Gulf itself from Corinth, the Gulf of Corinth, from I think the Brelos Pass, which is up that way. So, and that's all true. So I think mentally they'd be quite fatigued, but not necessarily quite so fatigued physically now.
And what, as I've said before, the combat scenes were excellent. I think they were really on point. Was there any one particular action scene that was more difficult to write than the others?
Not really in this book. I revised quite. So I had an early draft of the chapter that I've called "The Shootout at Corinth Canal," and a reader will understand why it's called that when it's read. But I had a chapter, an early draft of a chapter, which was a little bit different, and probably when I looked at it again, slightly a little bit too boys' ownish. Boys' Own magazine type of thing. Anyway, so I rewrote it, and the part where Rankin, spoiler alert again, that Rankin gets wounded, is yeah, I'm not so much hard, but the when he's helped up the line by the soldier who ultimately gets killed. I think I rewrote that several times to get the right sort of emotion into it.
Yeah.
But you always find you rewrite stuff quite often, because if you write something today and you pick it up again tomorrow, I don't like any of it. So it's heavily rewritten the day after the next, and then it keeps getting rewritten. I don't know. I must have rewritten the first pages of all 3 books 200 times each. Just
dedication.
Well, rewrite, change things.
What was the fishing village battle? Was that real? Was that based on true?
Well, that's based on Kalamata, but it is based on the geography there. So again, when we were exploring that part of Greece, we went to places like Nafplion, Metamorphosis, I never went to Mount Olympus, but I've got a pretty good idea what it looks like. But the little fishing village, it does exist, and I've just made it look like 1,000 other small Greek fishing villages. The road down there is may well be exaggerated. It's probably more like a goat track than a road, and possibly was. But anyway, that part is based, as I said earlier, on the Kalamata experience, but my people had to be able to get away, otherwise there would be no second book.
And one of the big lessons of one of the big themes of the book, sorry, is the big lessons of war. What would you say was the most significant lesson that Neil Rankin is taught?
His reactions change as the series goes on. His knowledge and understanding obviously increases, but he also carries now baggage, as they all would have done. The first man, who was a German, his name was Thomas, the first German he ever saw who had, at very close range, killed as a result of his action, or in fact he wasn't killed, that was the problem, as a result of his action, made him physically ill. And I think that reaction went with a lot of them. I've had some fantastic responses, I have to say, to these books from families of men who were there. And one in particular, I'll never forget, was a lady who wrote to me and said that her father, she knew he was tormented after the war for quite a long time, or until he died, I think. But anyway, she went one night to the movies with him, and she was a little girl, and she remembers that they went to a Western, and it was sort of 1950s era cowboys and Indians. So of course the cowboys won and the Indians were all probably slaughtered. But when she came away again, she said something like, "Daddy, did you ever kill any baddies during the war?" Or something like that. And apparently he took a long time to answer her, and he said to her, "There's probably a little girl just like you on the other side of the world who hasn't got a father because of me." And I think that sums up a lot about what these men ultimately came back with and what the reaction was to killing. Well, and just to the circumstances they're in. There are very, very few, I think, natural-born killers who can put it aside and forget it. And I'm not even sure natural-born killer is a fair description, but there are very few who can put it aside and forget it. And those that apparently can, I think, their personality is quite different to the vast majority of men that we're talking about. So just like Britain, this was a citizen army that had been trained to turn all of its civilized notions upside down and kill. And when you take people out of a civilized, even a tough civilized society, and turn it all on its head and make them kill people and then come back again, I think we now know it's totally naive to expect that they'll just fit straight back into place like they never left. And I think Rankin, as he goes on, is getting more and more of this feeling. It comes out more in the battle for Crete, I have to say, than the battle for Greece, because there's a scene there where without giving it all away, there's a scene there where, in fact, his sergeant slaps him in the face and tells him to get a grip of himself, and he does. But he's realised that none of them are ever going to be the same people that they were, and none of them who go home physically will be the same person as a whole.
Yeah.
So I think that in terms of the Battle for Greece, the first book, I think that realization only starts to dawn a little bit on him. But I think that the reactions between the men and the officer, they're all suppressed. I think that they've just got a job to do now, they realise, and it's sort of all suppressed while they try and get on with it.
Yeah. And
this is the sort of thing, to go back to the point, why not a history? This is the sort of thing that's very hard to get across. And if this comes out to the reader, then I'm really pleased about that, because this is not an easy subject, I don't think, but it's got to be a truthful portrayal of the subject. Otherwise, it's demeaning of the men who went.
And I think it does. I think it's very real. The emotions are very real. The action is very real. The situation, any situation that they're in, is very real. So it does come across.
Thank you. Good.
When the soldiers evacuate, what do you think was the biggest threat? The German army that was advancing, or the Luftwaffe that was above?
The Luftwaffe that was above. So by this time, we've also when I rewrote the last chapter to include or to alter the incident where they're watching the road between there and the little fishing village, and they see some prisoners brought along by a work party of Germans who are just looking at vehicles, basically, to look. It sounds like, or it looks like, they're looking at trying to find anything that's salvageable. So this is after the attack on the fishing village, and after Rankin and his party have gone to Monemvasia for the final evacuation. And Monemvasia is an unusual place because it's built on an extinct volcano, and it's connected to the mainland just by a causeway. And so it's easily defended. So they were watching, but I mean the Luftwaffe was busy bombing and so on, but they were comfortable enough to watch the road and to know that they weren't under any threat from the army at that point. So the little incident where one of the Allied prisoners attempts to escape and then gets shot dead, that to me is Rankin summing up his experience of the whole business in Greece. A futile effort that ended in a death, or plenty of deaths. So I think but when they get on the boat, the TLC, which they were called at that time, tank landing craft, they were in operation there, and that they were often the last, or some of them were virtually the last British ships out. But yeah, the threat then was definitely from the Luftwaffe, because they got away in the middle of the night. these things aren't speedy, and they wouldn't be that far offshore by daylight the following morning. But anyway, you then have to go to book 2 to find out what happens next.
well, my final question, and without spoiling it, how do you decide who lives and who dies?
Well, that's a funny thing, because often I don't. Often it just happens.
Mm.
Now, I had never had this experience until early on. A couple of characters did something that I frankly never expected, and I had never planned for, but it just happened. And when I first wrote that sequence, I don't want to make this sound grandiose or anything, but it was almost like me not writing. I just wrote these words, and these characters did what they did. And I really hadn't had any control over it. Well, it seemed like I hadn't.
Yeah.
Later on, I went back and rewrote it all and firmed it all up and made it much better. But I left the essence of it alone, because the essence was actually, I thought, really powerful. And to some extent, the deaths as we go along are almost random, as they would have been. It's hard to say how anyone is chosen, if you like. I never had a plan of where characters would go or how they would get there. And I had to constantly look back to make sure I wasn't referring to a character that had been killed in a previous chapter with some things. But when in the thick of it, though, it just seemed that someone did something that put them in a position, and then they were dead.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. Yeah.
I do. Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading the next one, and then the one after that.
Yeah. Well, I do have the one after that is this one. So book 3 is out. Book 3 was published in March of this year. Book 2 came out March 2025. Oh, sorry, no. This came out in March 25. Book 2 came out in March 24, and the first one was published in March 23. So unfortunately, I can't promise that book 4 will come out in March of 26, because it won't. But in the end, that sort of reflects that the 3 books all got written in a over a period of 20 years in a not very sequential fashion, but in a way that they ended up as being able to be turned into 3 books that could come out with relatively short time between them. So I'm in terms of a novel, in terms of writing, I think book 3 is the best of the lot. In terms of description of actual battles that actually happened in the way that they happened, I think book 2 is very sobering. It was very sobering to write. In fact, I can honestly say that after I'd written some of those battle scenes, I could not go back to them for weeks afterwards.
Wow.
Because they were so powerful. Yeah. So, So it's been well. First of all, I'm really thrilled the way the books have been received. That's a thrilling part. But it's also it's taken a lot to get them there, and I'm absolutely in awe of what they did. And I just wonder what our current generations would do. But I mean, I guess they'd stand up in the same way. But you can't help you can't help having a sense of that these young men taken into these situations, and then what they did and how they did it, and then they came home. And of course, I only knew them. So I was born in 1953, but I only knew them in the late 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And you would have no clue,
Mm.
no clue. But on the inside, we now know that a lot of them were in total turmoil.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I've been doing this show for, well, since last September,
Yes.
and you know, the men that I talk about, they're just heroes, all of them,
Mm.
and it really annoys me, even though I'm not old enough to be in that war. Um, it annoys me when people like supposedly the leader of the free world slags our guys off and says that they weren't on the front line, and it's absolutely disgraceful.
It
And
is.
I'm glad that there's fiction writers like yourself, and there's writers of historical fact that honor these guys, because they're just
Thank you.
heroes,
Yeah.
pure heroes.
Yeah. 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 Although they would never think of themselves in those terms,
No,
and they never
no,
did.
exactly.
They never did. They all they said, the most they would ever say is, "Oh, well, I just did my job
Yeah,
or did my
yeah,
duty." Yeah. And the leader of the free world, I I honestly wonder if the huge sacrifice that the United States made in the 1940s when they did get to the war, I just wonder what those men would think.
yeah, yeah. And it
Um,
just,
yeah.
yeah. Well, your heroes are in book one
Yes.
and book two and book three that you have.
Yep. Yep.
And
And if anyone wants to find out a little bit more about it, there's we have a website which is the Rabbit Hunter, which is all one word, .co.nz, and all one word in lowercase, so the Rabbit Hunter.co.nz, and the books are all available on Amazon.
yeah,
Um,
well, I'll put a link down below for
oh,
all
thank
three
you.
for all three. So
Yeah, and
yeah.
and the three books are available as all three paperback, ebook, and audio book.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Awesome.
no, thank you very much, John. I appreciate the opportunity greatly. I'd be happy to come back and talk about Crete if you would like me to.
I will. I
Um,
will. Yeah.
book three. Spoiler alert again. Book three says who at least Neil Rankin believes was responsible for the loss of Crete. I think it's quite complicated myself,
Mm-hmm.
but I would be happy to talk about that. Crete was an astonishing battle when you look at it.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's for perhaps for another time.
Definitely come back on, please. So,
Yes,
Christopher Worth, thanks so much for being my guest today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and it's a great book, and I'm sure it's going to be a great series.
thank you very
So,
much, John. Thank you, and thank you for your support. Thank you.
no problem. You take
Well,
care
and
now.
all the best with the podcast series. Yes, but it is
Cheers.
an important subject. Yeah,
It is. I think everybody should know, how we are who we are today,
who we
and
are,
it's
where
all
we
because
came
of these
from, and
guys.
why we're here. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
All right. Thank you very much.
well, take
Thanks.
care now.
Thanks. You
Bye
too.
bye.
Bye bye.